This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson announced a sweeping vision to transform the country into what he called the Great Society.
However, beneath the surface of things, there was trouble.
Johnson's Great Society programs and his massive escalation of the war in Vietnam drastically increased government spending and caused prices in the U.S. to shoot higher.
The war in Vietnam was, like all wars, the cause of a governmentally orchestrated inflation.
To protect the value of the dollar, Fed Chairman Bill Martin needed to raise interest rates, as he had done since 1951. But Lyndon Johnson was a different kind of president.
Johnson said, no, we don't want interest rates to rise. We don't want to derail the Great Society. We don't want to create a recession. We've got a war to fight. And the Fed caved in.
He knew that he shouldn't be doing that, but he believed it wasn't his responsibility to tell the Congress they couldn't run deficits.
I've talked for a long time about the independence of the Federal Reserve. That's independence within the government, not independence of the government.
So if there was a big private investment boom, he could raise interest rates to stop it. But if there was a big public expenditure boom, that was not his responsibility to stop. That was the Congress.
The results were disastrous. Vietnam and then Johnson's Great Society programs on top of that was too much demand for the economy, created this immense inflation.
At Bretton Woods, the U.S. had promised to be the world's reserve currency, backed by gold. But the Fed had created far more dollars than it could ever redeem in gold. And now the U.S. could no longer keep that promise.
And by 1971, it was clear the dollar could no longer be exchanged into gold. Finally, President Nixon, in front of a television camera, bumping, I think, Gunsmoke off the air. Maybe it was Bonanza.
Bonanza will be shown after a special report from NBC News.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
And that began the modern age of inflation.
For the first time in history, the dollar was just a piece of paper, backed only by faith in the Federal Reserve and its policies.
Now, what does this mean for you? Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
That promise was only as good as the Fed actions behind it. But bowing to pressure from Nixon and clinging to flawed economic theories, the Fed refused to raise rates. Over the next decade, the cost of living more than doubled, as the dollar lost more than half its value.
They would tell each other, we're not going to let the inflation get out of hand this time. And then the unemployment rate would rise, and all that would be forgotten because the political pressures would grow. Where did they come from? It came from Congress, it came from the administration, it came from the business community, it came from the labor unions, and it was just very hard to resist. The whole climate of opinion was against them.
And Arthur Burns, chairman of the Fed, he did not do what a good central banker should do and raise rates to break the inflation. And by the time the 70s ended, it was a total mess.
Prices went up infamously during the Carter presidency.
Inflation was increasing and unemployment was increasing at the same time. That wasn't supposed to happen.
Inflation hits everybody. Unemployment, even at its worst, hits only about 10% of the population at any one time. And so the public shifted its concern from unemployment to inflation in a massive way.
People began to say, we don't want it. We won't stand for policies that create ongoing inflation.
I really hate it because you pay so much for so little.
Good evening. Prices in the United States during the first 3 months of 1979 went up at an annual rate of 13%.
The question is, how long will this go on? Inflation running out of control. The answer, probably for years.
President Carter found himself on the defensive because inflation was becoming very unpopular.
Inflation is our friend.
And that's when Carter appointed Paul Volcker.
When I was appointed by Jimmy Carter, he was kind of up against it. It was a very difficult period. I told him we were going to have to adopt tighter policies, and I felt very strongly about the independence of the Federal Reserve, and that's the way I thought we should act. Burns said in a speech after he left the office, we knew, meaning we central bankers, that we had to reduce money growth back in 1964 or we were going to have inflation. And he lists all the reasons why he couldn't do it. It was that meeting that Paul Volcker left to do what Burns said couldn't be done. People don't like to raise interest rates. It's not very popular. And there was some resistance and fear of creating a recession and so forth.
It was a close thing for Volcker even to pull it off internally. He had a substantial battle within the Federal Reserve.
Volcker had tried to get the Fed governors to nudge interest rates upward, without success. So he tried a different tack, persuading them to focus on controlling the money supply. It was a sleight of hand, because the two are essentially the same. But it was a politically palatable tactic, and it worked.
And when he slowed the money growth rate, predictably, the interest rate went way up.
Neither he nor I nor anyone else had any idea of how high the interest rate was going to be.
8% to 9% to 10%.
15%.
18, 19, 20%.
21%. Really the highest levels in American history.
He told me, I never thought we'd have to go to 20%. But he did. That took courage.
Paul Volcker was villainized for his inflation suppression.
It was a very tough period. And there's a lot of opposition, and no doubt about it. And then somebody got the idea of sending in all these sawed-up 2x4s.
Builders would throw 2x4s on the steps of the Fed to protest Volcker's policies.
There's a lot of criticism, but people forget there was a lot of support, too. People wanted some leadership to get something done.
Now, the Fed was aware that it would almost certainly produce a recession. And Volcker says, I'm going to stick with my policy, even though the recession that begins in 1981 was the longest recession in post-war history. In that period of a couple of years, the world's view, the political view of the role of the Federal Reserve and its importance in the country changed dramatically. And I don't believe it would have been possible without a man of Paul Volcker's stature, who understood the business of central banking from soup to nuts, who understood the costs of not dealing with inflation.
Had those decisions been left to politicians, it's inconceivable that they would have, quote, voted for such a deep recession to bring the inflation rate down. That's sort of a generic flaw of political systems. Ask members of Congress to vote for things that cause short-term pain for long-term benefits, and it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to get the votes.
It's nice that we have leaders who step up and do the right thing now and then, take a long-term view. We could use more of it.
Paul Volcker has advised me of his decision not to accept a third term as a member and chairman of the Federal Reserve Board.
With inflation tamed, Volcker was expendable. And President Reagan would not reappoint him to a third term. But Volcker had restored faith in the dollar and in our central bank. And he'd laid the foundation for an era of unprecedented prosperity. It would be up to the next chairman to keep it alive. And for many years, it looked like he had.